Okay, so a coalition of kings just spent 10 years camped outside a single city, feeding an army large enough to strain the economy of an entire region, all supposedly to bring one woman home. That is the story everyone knows. Here is the story almost nobody tells. Behind the epic poetry and the wooden horse and the wrath of the gods sits one of the oldest and most brutal case studies in siege economics ever recorded. A conflict where the real prize was never really about honor at all, and where the actual financial mechanics of keeping tens of thousands of men fed, armed, and loyal for a full decade would bankrupt most ancient kingdoms in a matter of months. Whether every detail happened exactly as Homer wrote it is a question historians will argue forever. What is not in dispute is that the economic logic underneath the story is completely real, drawn directly from how Bronze Age warfare, trade, and plunder actually functioned. And that logic explains almost everything about why this particular war became the defining epic of the ancient world. Before we talk about the siege itself, we need to talk about why Troy was worth fighting over in the first place, because the honest answer has very little to do with romance and almost everything to do with geography. Troy sat at the mouth of the Dardanelles, the narrow strait connecting the Aegean Sea to the Black Sea, controlling one of the most valuable trade choke points in the entire ancient Mediterranean world. Any ship moving grain, timber, metal, or slaves between the Black Sea region and the wealthy trading cities of Greece and the Eastern Mediterranean had to pass directly beneath Troy's walls, and a city sitting on a choke point like that could tax, toll, or simply seize a percentage of everything moving through it. This single geographic fact turns the entire conflict from a myth about a stolen bride into something far more familiar to anyone who has studied ancient trade routes, a war over who controls the toll booth on one of the most valuable shipping lanes in the known world. Wealthy Troy, described across ancient sources with a level of prosperity that archaeological evidence at the site broadly supports, was not wealthy by accident. It was wealthy because of exactly this position, and a coalition of Greek kingdoms hungry for expanded trade access, and a share of that toll revenue had every rational economic incentive to want that control transferred into their own hands. Now let's talk about what it actually costs to raise the army that Homer describes gathering at Aulis before the fleet ever set sail, because this is where the economics get genuinely staggering, even accounting for the exaggeration inherent in epic poetry. The traditional accounts describe a coalition fleet numbering over 1,000 ships, drawn from dozens of separate kingdoms across the Greek world, each contributing men, vessels, and supplies under an oath sworn years earlier to defend the marriage of Helen and Menelaus, whichever suitor ultimately won her hand. Whether the true number was 1,000 ships or a small fraction of that inflated by centuries of oral storytelling, the underlying logistics problem was real, and it was enormous. Bronze Age warships of the period were oar-powered vessels crewed by dozens of rowers each, meaning a fleet of even a few hundred ships represented tens of thousands of fighting men who all needed to be fed, armed, and paid in some form. For the entire duration of a campaign, that ancient tradition places at 10 full years. Here is the detail that separates this conflict from almost any other ancient war we could examine, and it is the detail that makes the economics genuinely fascinating. A 10-year siege is not simply a longer version of a normal military campaign. It is an entirely different economic problem, because a typical Bronze Age war, fought between neighboring kingdoms over border disputes or succession claims, might last a single campaigning season, a few months in summer, when crops did not need tending and men could be spared from the fields. An army that stays in the field for a full decade cannot simply carry enough grain from home to sustain itself. It has to establish an entirely separate supply and provisioning system, essentially building a temporary economy from scratch in hostile territory, capable of feeding an army for years at a time without the benefit of the agricultural output the men would otherwise have been producing back home. This is precisely why ancient accounts of the siege repeatedly describe raiding expeditions against the smaller cities and territories surrounding Troy throughout the 10-year campaign, rather than the Greek coalition sitting idle outside the walls the entire time. These raids were not peripheral side plots to the main narrative. They were the economic backbone that made a decade-long siege logistically possible at all. Smaller settlements in the region were systematically stripped of grain stores, livestock, and portable wealth, providing the Greek camp with the ongoing food supply and plunder needed to sustain the army, while Troy itself remained too well fortified to fall through direct assault. This raiding economy also explains why the war produced such a steady stream of captured women and enslaved populations throughout its duration, a grim but economically central feature of ancient siege warfare, where human captives functioned as a form of transportable wealth and labor, distributed among the coalition's leaders as compensation and incentive for their continued participation in a campaign stretching years beyond what any individual king's home treasury could reasonably fund on its own. Now let's talk about the coalition itself, because holding together an alliance of dozens of independent kings, each commanding his own forces and answering to his own interests, for a full decade of warfare is a genuinely difficult organizational and financial achievement. And the tensions this created run through the entire narrative tradition surrounding the war. Agamemnon's position as overall commander was not absolute royal authority in the way a modern reader might assume. It was closer to a coalition leadership role, dependent on maintaining the loyalty and continued participation of allied kings who had their own kingdoms, their own resources, and their own competing claims on the spoils being generated by the campaign. The famous dispute between Agamemnon and Achilles that opens the Iliad, a conflict explicitly triggered by a disagreement over the division of captured plunder and captive women, is not an incidental character drama layered on top of the war. It is the central economic tension of coalition warfare made explicit, what happens when the distribution of spoils among allied commanders breaks down, and how quickly a fighting alliance can fracture when its members conclude the economic terms of their participation are no longer being honored fairly. This dynamic mirrors something we have seen across almost every large-scale collective enterprise examined on this channel, from revenue sharing in professional sports leagues to alliance structures in modern coalition warfare. Any arrangement where multiple independent parties combine resources toward a shared goal depends entirely on a perceived fair distribution of the eventual reward. And the moment that perception breaks down, even temporarily, the entire coalition's effectiveness can collapse, regardless of how strong each individual member remains on their own. Achilles, withdrawing his forces from active combat over a dispute about captured spoils, very nearly cost the entire coalition the war, a striking illustration of how the economic glue holding a military alliance together can matter just as much as the raw fighting strength each member contributes. Let's talk about what actually happens on the other side of the walls, because Troy's economics during the siege were entirely different from the besieging Greek coalition, and understanding this asymmetry explains why the city held out for as long as ancient tradition claims it did. A well-fortified, well-provisioned city under siege holds significant structural economic advantages over the besieging army camped outside its walls. Troy controlled its own agricultural hinterland for a substantial portion of the siege, maintained trade relationships and alliances with regional powers who could supply reinforcements and provisions through routes the Greek coalition could not fully blockade with the naval technology of the period, and did not face the same decade-long drain on a home kingdom's treasury that each individual Greek king back on the mainland was quietly absorbing throughout the entire campaign. In pure economic terms, a prolonged siege frequently favors the defender, whose costs are largely fixed and whose supply lines, if not fully cut off, remain intact, over the attacker, whose costs compound continuously with every additional year the campaign drags on, and whose army grows increasingly dependent on raiding and plunder simply to sustain itself in hostile territory far from home. This is precisely why the eventual fall of Troy, as the ancient tradition describes it, came not through the brute economic attrition of a prolonged siege, finally starving the city into submission, but through deception, the famous stratagem of the wooden horse, bypassing the city's fortifications entirely rather than defeating them through direct economic or military pressure. Whatever the literal historical truth behind that specific detail, the underlying logic is economically coherent. A siege that has already run for a decade, draining the resources and patience of a fracturing coalition back home, has strong incentive to seek a decisive shortcut rather than continuing to absorb the compounding costs of conventional siege warfare indefinitely. Let's build the two honest outcomes this kind of prolonged conflict could have produced, because both possibilities carry real economic weight within the tradition surrounding the war. The favorable outcome, the one the epic tradition ultimately describes, Troy falls and the city's accumulated wealth, built over generations from its position controlling that valuable trade choke point, becomes plunder distributed among the victorious coalition. Beyond the immediate spoils, control of the Dardanelles and the surrounding trade routes theoretically passes into the sphere of Greek influence, opening expanded access to Black Sea trade for the mainland kingdoms, whose kings had funded a full decade of warfare specifically to achieve exactly this outcome. For the individual kings who survived the campaign and returned home, the return on a decade-long investment of resources, men, and political capital was, at least in the epic telling, ultimately positive, even if catastrophically expensive and costly in ways no accounting ledger could fully capture. The unfavorable outcome, the one the broader mythological tradition surrounding the war's aftermath spends nearly as much narrative attention on as the siege itself, is that victory did not simply end the economic and political costs of the conflict. It merely converted them into a different form. The most famous returning heroes of the war, across the wider body of Greek myth beyond just Homer's own poems, come home to kingdoms destabilized by a decade of absent leadership, contested successions, and, in more than one prominent case, outright usurpation and violent betrayal waiting for them upon arrival. A decade spent extracting resources from a foreign siege economy did not simply pause the economic and political pressures building back home in the meantime. It left kingdoms vulnerable to exactly the kind of internal instability that a long-absent ruling king creates. A cost of prolonged foreign warfare that shows up not during the campaign itself, but in the years immediately following supposed victory, when the bill for a decade of neglected home governance finally comes due. There is one more layer worth understanding, because it explains why this particular conflict became the foundational epic of an entire civilization, rather than simply one war among many in a period of Greek history full of them. The Trojan War, whatever its precise historical kernel, functioned in the ancient Greek imagination as the ultimate case study in the true cost of extended conflict, a decade-long meditation on plunder, alliance, loyalty, and the gap between the glory promised at a war's outset and the far messier economic and political reality of actually sustaining and eventually surviving it. Every major economic mechanism we have examined across the sports, media, and business properties covered on this channel, scarce resources driving conflict, coalition partners requiring fair distribution of shared spoils to remain loyal, the compounding cost structure of prolonged commitment versus the fixed cost advantage of a well-provisioned defender, appears in some recognizable form embedded directly inside this 3,000-year-old story. So did the Trojan War actually pay for itself as an economic proposition for the coalition that fought it? The honest answer, drawn from the tradition's own telling, is that it depends entirely on which king you ask and how far past the fall of the city you are willing to keep counting the cost. The city fell, the plunder was real, and control of one of the ancient world's most valuable trade choke points changed hands. But the full economic reckoning of a 10-year war was never going to be settled the moment the walls came down. It was settled slowly, over the years that followed, in fractured kingdoms, contested thrones, and returning heroes who discovered that the true price of a decade spent chasing a foreign siege had been quietly accumulating back home the entire time, waiting for them long after the fighting itself was finished.